The sun had turned the Arizona Trail into something close to the surface of hell itself, and it was on that shimmering, merciless stretch of cracked earth that Eliza Caldwell fell. She had been walking for 6 hours straight, ever since the rear wheel of her wagon had cracked clean through on a hidden rock and listed sideways into a shallow ravine 2 miles back. The mules had been spooked so badly she had not been able to calm them, and in the end they had bolted, taking what remained of the wagon and nearly everything she owned with them into the scrub brush of the Arizona desert. She had managed to grab her canvas satchel, the one that held the last letter Thomas had written her before the fever took him, and her canteen. But the canteen had been nearly empty to begin with, and 6 miles of walking under a July sun in the year 1873 had drained the last drop of it more than an hour ago. Her belly was enormous. 7 months along, the midwife in Santa Fe had told her before she had set out on this fool's errand of trying to reach her sister's homestead in Tucson. 7 months along and alone on the Butterfield Overland Trail with nothing but a satchel, cracked boots, and the stubborn refusal to lie down and die that had kept the Caldwell women breathing through every disaster life had ever thrown at them. But stubbornness, she was discovering, had a physical limit, and hers arrived in the form of a wave of dizziness so total and consuming that the horizon tilted sideways and the red earth rushed up toward her face with terrifying speed. She did not even have time to put her hands out. The fall was hard, and the ground was harder, and for a long moment she lay there in the dust with the sun hammering down on the back of her neck and the baby turning slow circles inside her, as though it too was confused about which way was up. She pressed her cheek against the hot earth and breathed, just breathed, telling herself she would get up in just a moment more of stillness, and she would find the strength to push herself upright. But her arms trembled when she tried, and the dizziness surged back the moment she lifted her head, and she understood with the cold clarity of a woman who has spent enough time on the frontier to know what real danger feels like that she was in serious trouble. There was nobody on this trail. There had been nobody for hours. The last person she had seen was a freight wagon headed east at mid-morning, and she had waved at the driver and he had tipped his hat and rolled on past without stopping, because that was the way of things out here sometimes. People had their own troubles. People kept moving. She had not blamed him then, and she did not blame him now, but she did allow herself, face pressed against the burning Arizona dust, to wish quite fiercely that he had stopped. The sound came to her first as a vibration through the ground, a low, rhythmic thudding that she initially mistook for her own pulse hammering in her ears. But it grew louder and more distinct, and she recognized it with a flutter of desperate hope as the sound of a horse's hooves moving at a steady canter. She tried to push herself up again, managed to get one arm beneath her, and raised her head enough to see a dark shape coming down the trail from the north. The shape resolved itself through the heat shimmer into a man on horseback, a very large man on a very large horse. She tried to call out, but her throat was so dry that what emerged was barely more than a rasp. She waved her arm instead, a slow, exhausted sweep that she prayed was enough to catch his attention, and then her arm gave out, and she dropped back to the earth. Eliza Caldwell heard the hoofbeats change their rhythm as the horse slowed, and then she heard a voice, deep and unhurried, the kind of voice that belonged to a man who had spent more time talking to mountains than to people, say something low and steady to the animal. Then the hooves stopped entirely, and there were heavy bootfalls in the dust, and then a shadow fell across her that blocked the sun completely, and the relief of that shade on her overheated skin was so profound she nearly wept. "Hey now," the voice said, much closer now, and she heard a man crouching beside her. "Hey, can you hear me?" "I can hear you," she managed. A pair of hands, large, rough, calloused hands that were nonetheless careful in a way that surprised her, turned her gently onto her side so she was not face down in the dust. She blinked up at him and tried to take him in through the white blur of her sun-dazzled vision. He was enormous. That was the first thing she registered. Not tall exactly, though he was certainly that, but broad across the shoulders in a way that suggested he had spent years doing the kind of work that built a man from the inside out rather than any kind of deliberate effort. His arms were thick with muscle, the kind that came from hauling timber and packing mule loads up mountain passes, not from showing off at county fairs. His shirt was canvas, worn and faded from a blue that had long since retreated to the color of a winter sky, and it was rolled to the elbows to reveal forearms roped with sinew and tanned dark by the sun. His hair was the brown of pine bark, not quite shoulder length, and it fell across his forehead in a way that suggested it had not seen a barber in quite some time, and he had not lost any sleep over that fact. He had a beard that was well kept enough to suggest he was not entirely indifferent to his appearance, and eyes that she initially thought were brown but resolved, as her vision cleared, into something much closer to dark amber, the color of river water over flat stone in the late afternoon. He was looking at her with an expression of focused, unhurried concern that struck her as strangely comforting. Not panicked, not embarrassed, simply present and attentive in the way of a man who has dealt with emergencies before and knows that the most useful thing you can do in an emergency is stay calm. "How long have you been down?" he asked. "Not long," she said. "The wagon broke. The mules ran. I've been walking since about 8 this morning." He looked at the position of the sun, then looked back at her. "That is 4 hours or better. How much water do you have?" "None. My canteen ran out about an hour ago." He said nothing about that, which she appreciated. He simply stood, moved to his horse with unhurried efficiency, unhooked a leather canteen from the saddlebag, and came back and crouched beside her again. He helped her sit up, supporting her back with one hand in a manner that was careful not to jostle the belly that would have made her condition obvious to anyone with eyes, and held the canteen to her lips. The water was warm from the heat of the afternoon, but it was real water, and there was plenty of it, and she drank until he gently pulled it back and said, "Slow now. Too fast will make you sick." She nodded and let him withdraw it, and then she sat there in the dust of the Butterfield Trail with a stranger's hand warm against her back and let herself breathe for the first time in what felt like hours. "I am Eliza Caldwell," she said, because it seemed important to establish that she was a person with a name rather than simply a problem to be solved. "Jed Harlan," he said. "Where were you headed?" "Tucson. My sister has a homestead about 40 miles east of town. I was trying to reach her before the baby comes." He looked at her belly with the direct, unsentimental assessment of a man who had probably helped animals birth young in difficult conditions and understood the basic urgency of the situation. "When?" "The midwife in Santa Fe said early September, so perhaps 6 or 7 weeks. "We are not 40 miles from anywhere safe," he said, with a quiet matter-of-factness that she found oddly reassuring compared to the patronizing alarm she might have expected. "Nearest town is Cottonwood Creek, about 8 miles north of here. I know the woman there who runs the boarding house. She has good sense and a steady hand." He said it as though the matter were settled, which perhaps it was, and he stood and moved to his horse again. She watched him go, this enormous, quiet-moving man who had appeared out of the heat shimmer, like something the desert had decided to conjure for her particular benefit. The horse was a buckskin gelding, big and solid, with the kind of calm temperament that came from being handled well for a long time. Jed Harlan came back with a bedroll that he spread flat on the ground beside her, and she looked at it with some confusion until he said, "I am going to help you up. You cannot ride in the state you are in without resting first. Drink more water first and sit in the shade." There was no shade for 50 yards in any direction, but he solved this problem by leading the horse close and arranging it so that its shadow fell over the bedroll, and the practicality of this was so simple and effective that she found herself smiling despite everything. "You have done this before," she said. "Not this exactly," he said, settling himself cross-legged in the dust nearby with the natural ease of a man who had spent most of his life sitting on the ground. "But close enough." She rested for 20 minutes, drinking small amounts of water at intervals the way he directed, eating the strip of dried venison he produced from his saddlebag, and pressed on her with the quiet insistence of a man who expected to be listened to without having to make a speech about why. The food helped more than she had expected. Some of the whiteness left the edges of her vision, and the dizziness receded to a manageable presence at the back of her head. "My husband died 4 months ago," she heard herself say, not entirely sure why she was telling him this, except that it seemed important he understand how she had come to be alone on this trail. "Fever. We were in Santa Fe. We had only been there 3 months. We came from Ohio. He had a commission to survey land for the railroad. When he died, I had very little money and no family within 1,000 miles, except my sister in Tucson. So I decided to go to her. Jed Harlan listened to all of this with the same unhurried attention he seemed to bring to everything. When she finished, he said, "That was a hard road." "Yes," she said simply, "and you decided to travel it anyway." I did not see that I had much choice. He looked at her for a moment with those amber eyes, and there was something in the look that was not pity, but was perhaps something adjacent to respect, and she found that she liked it considerably better than pity would have felt. "My horse can carry double," he said. "He is steady. I will ride behind you and make sure you do not fall." She looked at the horse, and then back at him. "I'm not a small woman at the moment," she said. The corner of his mouth moved in what might have been a smile. "He weighs 1,200 pounds, he said. "You will not trouble him." And that was how Eliza Caldwell, widow, 7 months along, found herself lifted from the burning Arizona dust by 2 arms that were more than equal to the task, and settled onto the back of a large, patient buckskin horse, while the largest and quietest man she had ever met swung up behind her with the ease of long practice and gathered the reins around her and pointed them north toward Cottonwood Creek. She had not been held like that in 4 months, since Thomas died. She had not let herself think too much about what that particular absence felt like, because there had always been something more urgent to deal with, some practical crisis to solve. But she thought about it now, riding north through the Arizona heat with the solid wall of Jed Harlan's chest behind her, and something that she had been holding tightly closed in her chest for months cracked open just slightly, and she let it, because she was exhausted, and the baby was kicking, and the man behind her smelled like pine resin and wood smoke and leather, and none of it was a danger. Cottonwood Creek materialized out of the desert in the late afternoon, a collection of sun-bleached timber buildings arranged along a single main street that ran roughly north to south, with a water tower at one end and a livery stable at the other, and the hopeful little flag of a post office somewhere in between. It was small, smaller than the Santa Fe streets she had grown accustomed to, but it was solid-looking and real, and after the empty miles of trail she had traveled that day, it looked to Eliza like something close to paradise. The woman who ran the boarding house was named May Alcott, and she was 60 if she was a day, with iron gray hair pinned in a practical bun and the sharp dark eyes of a woman who had seen everything the frontier had to offer and had formed clear opinions about most of it. She came out onto the porch of the 2-story frame building that served as both her home and her business when she saw Jed ride up, and she looked from him to Eliza and back to him with an expression that cycled rapidly through surprise, assessment, and decision in the space of about 3 seconds. "Jed Harlan," she said, "you look like you picked something up on the road." "She collapsed on the Butterfield Trail," he said, swinging down and reaching up for Eliza with both hands. "Heat, no water, wagon broke." "I can walk," Eliza said, and Jed looked at her. "You could," he said. "You do not need to." He lifted her down as though she weighed considerably less than she did, and May Alcott was already holding the door open with the efficiency of a woman who had made up her mind. "Bring her inside," May said. "I have a room on the ground floor. Lord knows we do not need her climbing stairs." The room on the ground floor was small and clean, with whitewashed walls and a window that faced west, and a cotton quilt on the narrow iron bed that had been washed so many times it had faded to a gentle ghost of its original pattern. It was the most welcoming space Eliza had encountered since leaving Ohio, and she sat on the edge of the bed and felt her eyes fill with tears that she absolutely refused to allow to fall, because she was a Caldwell, and Caldwells did not weep in front of strangers. May brought water and a cloth, and busied herself checking Eliza over with the competent, no-nonsense thoroughness of a woman who had served as the closest thing to a doctor Cottonwood Creek had available for the better part of 20 years. She declared Eliza dehydrated, but not dangerously so, the baby's movement strong and regular, and ordered her to stay horizontal for the rest of the evening with no arguments entertained. "I need to send word to my sister," Eliza said. "In the morning," May said firmly. "Tonight you sleep." Jed Harlan stood in the doorway through this entire proceeding, which Eliza noticed because he filled the doorway somewhat substantially, and it was difficult not to notice. He had taken his hat off, she registered, which she had not paid attention to until this moment, and the gesture struck her as unexpectedly courteous. When May had finished her examination and pulled a second blanket over Eliza despite the heat of the evening, Jed said, "I will be in town a day or two, if you need anything." May looked at him sideways with an expression that Eliza could not entirely decode. "Town is lucky then," May said. He nodded at Eliza once, a steady, direct acknowledgement of her as a person rather than a problem. And then he turned and disappeared from the doorway, and she listened to his boots on the floor, and then on the porch boards, and then on the packed earth of the street until she could not hear them anymore. She slept for 11 hours, which was more than she had slept at any single stretch since Thomas had taken ill, and in the morning she felt so much more herself that it was almost alarming. May brought her breakfast, actual cooked eggs and cornbread and coffee, the first real coffee Eliza had tasted in weeks, and sat on the wooden chair beside the bed with her own cup and regarded Eliza with the frank assessment of a woman who asked all her questions with her eyes before she bothered with her mouth. "Jed Harlan is a good man," May said, after they had been drinking coffee in companionable silence for a few minutes. "He was very kind," Eliza said. "He spends most of his time up in the mountains," May said, "trapping, hunting, sometimes scouting for the army, though he does not love that work. He comes through town 3-4 times a year, has a cabin up in the Mazatzal range." She paused. "He has never brought anyone in off the trail before." Eliza looked at her. "He must have seen I needed help." "Must have," May agreed, with a tone that suggested she had drawn conclusions on this subject that she was not yet ready to share. A knock at the door came mid-morning, tentative enough to belong to someone who was not entirely sure they were welcome. May opened it, and Eliza, sitting up in bed with one of May's old catalogs to look at, saw Jed Harlan standing on the porch with his hat in his hands and an expression of careful neutrality that she suspected was the closest he came to showing uncertainty. "I thought to see how you were doing," he said, "and I brought something." He held out a cloth-wrapped bundle that proved, when she opened it, to contain a pair of women's boots, smaller than the cracked, failing things she had worn to pieces on the trail, and they were real leather with good, thick soles, not new, but clearly well preserved. "Where did you find these?" she asked. "General store had them in back," he said. "Trading stock. They looked about your size." She looked at him for a long moment. He was standing in the morning light with his dark amber eyes perfectly steady on her face and his hat turning slowly in his large hands, and she understood that this was a man who did not make gestures like this casually. He had gone to the general store first thing in the morning and bought her boots, which was a practical and thoughtful and quietly generous thing to do for a woman he had known for approximately 12 hours. "Thank you," she said, and meant it with the full weight of someone who understood the value of what they were receiving. He nodded once. Then he said, "I'm having a look at your wagon today. Someone mentioned seeing a rig in the ravine about 2 miles south. I will see if the wheel can be repaired." "You do not have to do that," she said. "I know," he said simply. May, who had been watching all of this from the corner of the room with the expression of someone watching a play they had been anticipating for some time, said nothing at all, which was itself a kind of statement. Jed was gone most of the day. He came back in the late afternoon with news that was mixed in the way of most news on the frontier. The wagon body was salvageable, and he had managed to recover several of her trunks that had been thrown from the wagon before the mules had dragged it further into the brush, but the wheel was beyond repair without a new rim that would have to be ordered from Prescott, and that would take 2 weeks at least. 2 weeks in Cottonwood Creek. She had not planned for 2 weeks. She sat with this information on the porch of May's boarding house in the cooling evening air, watching the main street settle into its end-of-day rhythms, horses being led to the livery, the sound of the saloon 2 doors down starting up its nightly business, a group of children chasing a dog through the dust with the energy of people who had not spent the afternoon in the sun. The sky to the west was doing extraordinary things with color, as the Arizona sky tended to do at dusk, laying out shades of orange and rose and deep violet with an extravagance that seemed designed to make up for the harshness of the hours preceding it. Jed came up the porch steps and settled himself in the chair beside her, and they sat in comfortable quiet for a few minutes watching the sky perform. "I can stay a while," he said. "See that you get on the road safely when the wheel's repaired." She looked at him. "You have your own affairs to attend to." "Nothing that will not keep," he said. She thought about Thomas, about the man he had been, gentle and bookish and enthusiastic, full of plans and theories about the West that had never quite accounted for the reality of it. She had loved him honestly and completely, in the comfortable, unexciting way of two people who had known each other all their lives and followed the path that seemed natural. His death had left her hollowed out in a way that had less to do with passion and more to do with the sudden removal of the familiar weight of another person's presence from her daily life. She had not known, until Jed Harlan sat beside her on this porch, how much she had missed simply sitting quietly next to someone who felt solid. "Tell me about your mountains," she said. He glanced at her sideways. "What about them?" "May says you live up in the Mazatzal range. I have never seen mountains that big. The ones in Ohio are barely hills." Something shifted in his expression, a softening, barely perceptible, the way a landscape looks different when a cloud moves off the sun. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the reddening sky, and he talked about his mountains. He talked about them the way some men talk about their children, with a mixture of pride and affection and the deep knowledge of someone who has paid close attention for a long time. He described the way the pine forest smelled after rain, different from any rain-wet smell anywhere else on Earth because of the specific combination of pine resin and wet granite and thin mountain air. He described the elk he tracked through the high meadows in the fall and the way the aspens turned in October, a yellow so vivid and pure it looked like the mountain was generating its own light from the inside. He described his cabin. Small, he said, 2 rooms built with his own hands from timber he felled himself over 3 summers, and the creek 20 yards from the door that ran cold even in August. She listened to all of it with the full attention she had given very few things in the past difficult months, and when he finished, she said, "It sounds like peace." He looked at her directly then, with those amber eyes, and said, "It is." The 2 weeks passed with a rhythm that surprised her by how natural it felt. She helped May with the boarding house in the mornings, which May accepted with the grace of someone who recognized that a woman like Eliza Caldwell would rather be useful than idle, and she rested in the afternoons as her body continued to demand. The baby grew more active by the day, distinct movements now that she could track with her hands, and sometimes in the quiet of the afternoon, she lay on her side in the whitewashed room and talked to it, told it about its father, about Ohio, about the plan she had for them in Tucson, about the aunt it would meet there who kept chickens and grew melons and had written letters full of the particular warm practicality that ran in the Caldwell blood. Jed found reasons to be present. He repaired May's porch railing, which had been listing for months, and replaced 2 boards in the barn behind the boarding house, and helped the blacksmith at the far end of town with a job that required an extra set of hands the size of Jed's. He spent evenings on the porch, and some afternoons, and gradually, the particular quality of the quiet that existed between him and Eliza changed its character, became less the silence of 2 strangers being polite, and more the silence of 2 people who had discovered they could exist in the same space without effort. He brought her things without being asked about it, not extravagant things because neither of them had money to spare for extravagance, but thoughtful ones. A book from the post office man's lending shelf, chosen because she had mentioned offhand that she loved to read. A small jar of honey from the woman who kept bees at the edge of town, because she had said once that cornbread tasted better with honey. A bunch of the small desert wildflowers that grew in the brush at the edge of the trail, pale yellow, which he placed in a tin cup on her windowsill and seemed mildly embarrassed about when she thanked him for them. She learned him by degrees, the way you learn a place by living in it, rather than by reading a map. She learned that he was 31 and had come west from Kentucky at 19 with nothing but a rifle and a willingness to work. That he had spent 3 years with a trapping outfit, learning the mountains from men who had spent 40 years in them and had opinions about everything from beaver dams to weather systems. That he had built his cabin alone, and that alone was the way he had always preferred things, not because he disliked people, but because the mountains had simply always been more honest with him than people tended to be. She learned that he had been engaged once, at 23, to a woman in Prescott who had ultimately married a merchant because a merchant could offer a future that made more ordinary sense than a mountain man could. He did not tell this story with bitterness, only with the quiet matter-of-factness of someone who has processed a thing completely and set it down and walked away from it. She found herself telling him things she had not told anyone, small private things that accumulated into a portrait of who she was beneath the widow and the traveling woman and the practical frontier survivor. She told him about her mother's garden in Ohio and how she had learned to identify every plant in it by the time she was 7. She told him about the books she and Thomas had packed. Too many books, people had said, and she had been mildly insulted by that, because there was no such thing as too many books. She told him about the particular terror of being in Santa Fe when the fever had begun, the way the doctors had looked when they came out of Thomas's room, the look that meant the news was coming, and it was not going to be good news. She did not cry telling him this, but she did stop for a moment, and he said nothing, which was the right thing. On the 14th day, a man from Prescott arrived with the wagon wheel rim, and the blacksmith had it fitted by nightfall. Eliza stood in the late afternoon light and watched it take shape, and felt the 2 weeks compressing behind her into something she was not ready to call loss, but that carried a weight she had not expected. She went looking for Jed that evening and found him at the livery, checking his horse's hooves with the attentive care of a man who understood that the horse's health was inseparable from his own. He looked up when she came in, and whatever he read in her face made him straighten slowly and give her his full attention. "The wheel is done," she said. "I heard," he said. "I should leave tomorrow," she said. "I need to reach my sister before the baby comes." "I know," he said. She looked at him in the dim golden light of the livery, this enormous, quiet, pine and smoke-smelling man who had lifted her out of the dust of the Arizona Trail 2 weeks ago, and had not once since made her feel like a burden, which was a more remarkable thing than she had adequately acknowledged. "I do not know how to thank you," she said, "for the water and the boots and fixing the wagon and staying." He was quiet for a moment, turning a curry brush in his hands. Then he said, without looking at her, "I would rather come with you." The livery was very still around them. Somewhere outside, the evening birds were starting up in the mesquite. "Jed," she said carefully. "I'm not talking about anything you are not ready for," he said, and finally looked at her. "I'm talking about getting you to Tucson safely. 40 miles of trail is 40 miles of trail. After that is after that." She looked at him for a long time. The amber eyes were steady and honest as they always were, and there was nothing in them that was pressure or performance, just a man saying plainly what he wanted and leaving the rest entirely up to her. "All right," she said. They left the next morning at first light, Eliza driving the repaired wagon and Jed riding the buckskin gelding alongside. May Alcott saw them off from her porch with the expression of a woman whose suspicions had been thoroughly confirmed and who was not displeased about it. "You come back through when the baby is born," May called after them. "I want to hear how it all turns out." The 40 miles to the Tucson area took 2 days, which was sensible given the heat and the condition of the trail and the fact that Eliza's body had strong opinions about the pace at which it was willing to travel. They camped the first night in the dry bed of a creek where cottonwood trees offered genuine shade, and the temperature dropped to something almost comfortable after dark. Jed built a fire that was small and efficient, the way he did everything, and produced from his saddlebags a dinner that was simple. Dried venison and hardtack and coffee, but hot and filling, and they sat on opposite sides of the fire as propriety suggested they should. But the conversation was not the conversation of two people sitting on opposite sides of anything. They talked for hours, long after the fire had burned to coals, in the way of two people who have discovered that the other person contains multitudes and are in a mild hurry to know all of them, before some external circumstance makes further conversation impossible. He told her about the winter he had spent entirely alone in the mountains, a trapping season when the partner he'd arranged to go out with had broken his leg in September, and Jed had gone on anyway, rather than lose the season, and had spent 4 months in deep snow with only his horse and a dog he'd named Pilgrim for company. She asked if he'd been lonely. He thought about it for a while, the way he thought about everything, with genuine consideration rather than a reflex, and said that he had been solitary, which was different from lonely, but that by February he had started talking out loud to himself more than he thought was strictly healthy. She laughed at that, and the sound of her laughing in the desert night surprised them both with how free it sounded. "I have not laughed like that in a while," she said. "It is a good sound," he said simply. She looked at the fire coals and said, "Thomas was funny. That was one of the things I loved about him. He could make a joke about nearly anything without it ever being unkind. I miss that." She paused. "I miss him. But I think I have been so busy surviving since he died that I have not always had time to miss him properly." "You do not have to rush it," Jed said. "No," she said. "I know." She lay awake for a while after they had settled on their respective sides of the camp, Jed a respectful distance away, listening to the night sounds of the desert, the small rustlings and the distant cry of something she could not identify. The baby moved, and she put her hand on her belly in the dark and thought about the strange and improbable shape her life had taken, how nothing about the last year would have been predictable from the vantage point of a year before it, and how sometimes the most unexpected arrangements turned out to be the ones that fit. They arrived at her sister's homestead on the second afternoon. Clara Burrows, née Caldwell, was 33 and had been in Arizona for 6 years and had the look of a woman who had made peace with hard country and come out ahead in the negotiation. She came running from the house the moment she spotted the wagon coming down her lane, and the reunion between the two sisters was the kind that involved a great deal of talking at once and some crying that was not quite the contained variety, and Jed stood back from it with the tactful distance of a man who understood that some moments had nothing to do with him. Clara's husband, Robert Burrows, was a square, sunburned man with kind eyes and the handshake of someone who had been working ranching land long enough that his grip was purely automatic. He shook Jed's hand and said, "We owe you a considerable debt." "She would have managed," Jed said. "Yes," Robert said, with the certainty of someone who had been listening to stories about the Caldwell women for 6 years. "But it is better that she did not have to." Clara insisted that Jed stay, not just overnight but for as long as he would, and he accepted this with the quiet grace of a man who had been on the road long enough to appreciate a real bed and a table with actual food on it. He helped Robert with the morning chores, with the natural ease of someone who had done every kind of physical work there was and found all of it equally straightforward. And Robert, who Eliza gathered was not a man who offered his trust easily, was visibly won over within 48 hours. The weeks that followed had a texture that Eliza would remember for the rest of her life as something like the word abundance, though it was not abundant in any material way. The homestead was small and the work was constant, and the heat of the late Arizona summer was not something that conceded much to human comfort. But there was Clara's company, which was the balm of being known and loved by someone who had known you your whole life. There was the particular satisfaction of useful work, of which there was plenty on a working ranch. And there was Jed, who had stopped speaking about his mountains and his solitary life in quite the same terms, and who had started speaking, carefully and with the slow deliberateness he brought to anything that mattered, about the future in ways that included more than one person. One evening toward the end of August, with the first hint of the season's turn just beginning to soften the edges of the heat, they were sitting on the split-rail fence at the edge of the Burrows property, watching the sky go through its nightly performance, and Jed said, without preamble, "I have been thinking about my cabin." "Have you?" she said. "It needs more than 2 rooms," he said. "For what I am thinking." She looked at him. The last light was on his face and his eyes were on the horizon, and his jaw was set with the particular set it had when he was working his way up to something that required more words than usual. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He turned and looked at her then, fully and directly. "I'm thinking that I would like to build a life with you," he said. "You and the baby. I'm thinking I would like to be the kind of man this child has around, and I would like to be the kind of man you have around, and I'm saying it plainly, because I think you deserve plainness and not hints and waiting to see if you catch on." Eliza was quiet for a moment. The desert air moved against her face and the baby shifted, a long, rolling motion that had become familiar and dear. "Chet? Jed?" she said. "I am carrying another man's child." "I know that," he said. "That child is Thomas's, and Thomas should be remembered and honored, and I would never try to be anything other than what I am to that child, which is a man who is there and who cares. but caring is not a small thing. She looked at him for a long time. The honest amber eyes, the calm solidity of him, the way he had never once in their entire acquaintance tried to be anything other than exactly what he was. "I am not ready to be a wife yet," she said carefully. "I think I need time to find my footing, to be a mother first, and to grieve properly what I lost. I think you deserve honesty about that." "I am not going anywhere," he said. "I have time." "You would wait," she said. "I would wait," he said, with the absolute simplicity of a man stating a fact he has already lived with for a while and found he can carry comfortably. She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the fence rail, and he turned his hand over and held hers. And they sat like that as the sky finished its performance and the first stars came out over the Arizona desert, and it was not a declaration of anything except perhaps the beginning of one, and it felt exactly right. The baby came on a Tuesday morning in early September, which was almost exactly when the midwife in Santa Fe had predicted, which was something Eliza found obscurely satisfying about the whole business. Clara served as midwife, and Jed waited on the porch, which was where men were expected to wait in 1873, and did so with a stillness that Robert Burroughs later said reminded him of a man standing guard over something important. When Clara appeared at the door in the late morning and said that it was done and that everyone was well, Jed stood up from the porch step where he had been sitting for 4 hours and said thank you, in a voice that had lost some of its usual composure. The baby was a boy. Eliza named him Thomas William Caldwell, keeping her own name because it was her name, and the baby's father's name was already carried in the first name, and she intended to give them both their due. He was red-faced and strong-lunged and deeply unimpressed with the world he had arrived in, and he expressed this opinion vigorously for the first several weeks of his life, in a way that suggested he had inherited certain Caldwell opinions about what constituted acceptable conditions. Jed held him for the first time on the evening of his second day, when Clara brought him out to where Jed was sitting on the porch. He held the baby with the careful, total attentiveness of a man holding something he understands to be precious and irreplaceable. And Thomas William looked up at him with the unfocused, profound gaze of the very newly arrived, and something moved through Jed's expression that was not a thing that could be named simply. "He is something," he said quietly. "He really is," Eliza said from the doorway, watching them both. The months that followed were the months of settling. Eliza recovered her strength with the practical determination that characterized everything she did, and within 6 weeks was fully herself again, moving with purpose through the rhythms of the homestead, with a baby on her hip, and an appetite for work that made Clara look at her with a mixture of admiration and mild concern. Thomas William grew with the speed that babies grow at, when they have good food and warm care and are held by enough people who love them, and he developed early a particular fondness for Jed that manifested first as a tendency to stop crying the moment Jed picked him up, a fact that nobody commented on but that everyone noticed. Jed stayed through October, then November. He helped Robert with the fall cattle work, which needed more hands than Robert had, and Robert paid him a fair wage without being asked, because that was the kind of man Robert was. He built a proper wood store for the winter, splitting and stacking with the mechanical efficiency of a man for whom physical work was simply the medium through which life expressed itself, and the woodpile grew so large that Robert said they would not burn through half of it by spring. On a November evening when the air had finally taken on a genuine chill and the smell of the desert had changed to something drier and cleaner, Eliza found Jed at the corral fence, looking north toward the mountains. "You are thinking about your cabin," she said. "I am," he said. "Are you ready to go back?" He turned and looked at her, and in the 2 months since Thomas William had arrived, she had been watching him with the attention of a woman who is beginning to know someone the way you know the back of your own hand, and she could read his face now in ways she could not have before. "I am thinking," he said, "that if I go back to the cabin, I will be thinking about this every day that I am there." "And you are thinking that is not a very efficient way to live," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "No," he said, "it is not." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains herself. Thomas William was asleep inside, with Clara watching him, and the evening air was soft and cool, and the stars were coming out in their dozens over the dark silhouettes of the saguaro. "I am ready," she said. "I think I did not know I would be this soon, but I am." He was very still for a moment. Then he turned and looked at her with such direct, uncomplicated hope that she felt something warm spread through her chest from the inside. "I would like to marry you," he said, "if you will have me." "I will have you," she said. "I will have you very much." He reached out and took her face in his hands, those large, rough, careful hands, and looked at her for a moment with the amber eyes that had been looking at her honestly since the first moment she had opened her eyes on the hot Arizona trail and found him there. And then he kissed her, and it was the first kiss they had shared, and it was everything that a first kiss ought to be when it follows months of knowing someone and choosing them daily. They were married in December, a small ceremony in the living room of the Burroughs homestead, with Robert as witness, and Clara crying with unashamed enthusiasm, and Thomas William asleep in a basket on the floor, oblivious to the entire event. The minister from the nearest town with a minister rode out for the occasion and performed the ceremony with appropriate solemnity. And afterward there was a dinner that Clara had spent 2 days preparing, and the 5 of them sat around the table in the lamplight and ate and talked and laughed in the way of people who have become a family in the truest sense of the word, which is to say, not because they were born into it, but because they chose it. Jed looked across the table at his wife and his stepson, and something in his face that had always been slightly watchful, the look of a man who has learned not to expect certain things, was simply gone, replaced by something uncomplicated and complete that Robert Burroughs would later describe, if anyone asked him, as a man who had finally come home. They stayed through the winter, which was the practical decision. Traveling to the mountains in December with a 3-month-old was not sensible, and neither Jed nor Eliza was a person who let sentiment override sense. It was also, Eliza admitted to herself, not an entirely unwelcome extension, because having Clara close in the early weeks of her marriage was a comfort she had not known she would want until it was available. The winter was mild by the standards of the central Arizona highlands, which still meant cold nights and occasional frost, and the particular dry cold of desert winter that got into your bones in a different way than the Ohio winters of Eliza's childhood. They slept warm and worked hard and spent evenings by the fire in a contented domesticity that Eliza found both new and deeply familiar, as though she had lived this life before in some version of herself that had simply been waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. She watched Jed with Thomas William through those winter months with a love that expanded each time she observed it, because he was so entirely himself with the baby, direct and gentle and patient in a way that was not performance, but simply character. He talked to Thomas William the way he talked to everything he cared about, in the low, unhurried voice that said, "I am here, and I'm paying attention," and the baby responded to it with the simple animal recognition of a small creature who understands safety when it finds it. In February, Jed rode north to check on his cabin, a 3-day trip up into the Mazatzal range that he had been putting off since November. He came back with a report. The cabin had weathered the winter well. One shutter needed replacing. The wood stove was sound, and he had decided that the addition of 2 rooms was going to be the first project of the spring. 2 rooms, Eliza said. For the 3 of us? For the time being, he said, with a perfect and infuriating composure that she was slowly learning to find more amusing than frustrating. Spring came to the Arizona desert the way it always did, with a sudden, extravagant eruption of color that seemed designed to reward anyone who had endured the winter with sufficient patience. The saguaro stood in bloom. The desert floor was briefly covered in wildflowers of every shade that the spectrum could manage, and the mountains to the north looked as though they had been freshly painted. They said goodbye to Clara and Robert in March, with Thomas William now 6 months old, round and cheerful and deeply interested in everything, strapped to Eliza in the carrier Clara had sewn for her from 2 wool blankets. Clara cried, and Eliza held her sister for a long time and promised to write, which she had every intention of keeping. Robert shook Jed's hand and said, with the brevity of a man who means things more than he says them, "Good man." Jed nodded, and that was enough. The road north to the Mazatzal range was different from the desert trail in ways that Eliza cataloged with the attentiveness of a woman reading a new book. The desert gave way gradually to higher scrubland, the saguaro thinning and being replaced by juniper and then by pine, and the air changed, thinner, and carrying exactly the smell that Jed had described on the porch of May's boarding house 9 months ago, the pine resin and wet granite smell of a place that had been waiting to be shown to her. His cabin sat in a fold of the mountain where a creek cut through granite, exactly as he had described it, though the description had not adequately conveyed the particular quality of light in that place, the way the mountain shut out the worst of the afternoon sun, and the creek threw light back up onto the underside of the pine boughs in shifting patterns that changed all day as the water moved. The cabin itself was small and solid, built with the precision of a man who does not build things he is not willing to bet his life on, with a covered porch that faced east and caught the morning sun, and a wood stove whose flue he had already cleaned and whose firebox was already laid with split kindling, ready to light, because that was the kind of man he was. Eliza stood in the doorway of the cabin and looked in at the 2 rooms, the main room with its table and stove and shelves of neatly organized supplies, and the smaller room beyond with its rope-strung bed, and she felt something that required a moment to identify, being unused to it in its full strength, which was the feeling of being precisely where she was supposed to be. "It is perfect," she said. Jed, behind her with Thomas William asleep in his arms, said, "It needs work." "It is perfect," she said again, and turned and looked at him, and whatever she saw in his face made her smile in the way she had almost forgotten she was capable of smiling, the unguarded way that meant nothing was held back. They unpacked in the late afternoon and cooked supper on the wood stove with the door of the cabin open so they could hear the creek, and Thomas Williams sat in the wooden cradle that Jed had built over the winter and apparently shipped ahead with a freight rider, a fact she discovered only when she saw it sitting in the corner of the smaller room, smoothed and fitted with a mattress of clean ticking. She stood and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Jed appeared behind her. "I made it in January," he said, "when I went up to check the cabin." "You made it in January," she said. "I did not want to presume." She turned around and kissed him, which cut off the rest of the sentence in a way that he did not appear to find objectionable. The first summer in the mountains was the summer Eliza learned what it meant to live in a place that had not been domesticated, that was still, in its fundamental nature, wild, and to love that wildness rather than merely tolerate it. She learned to read weather from the way clouds built over the peaks in the afternoon. She learned to identify the tracks of the animals that used the creek, the delicate prints of deer, and the broader marks of the elk that came down from the high meadows at dusk. And once, on a September morning, the unmistakable large-footed signature of a bear that had passed 20 yards from the cabin door in the night. She learned to put food up in the way of the mountains, dried and smoked and sealed against the winter that would come with thoroughness and commitment, and found that she had opinions about this process that she had not previously known she possessed. She wrote to Clara every month, letters that were full of the specific sensory details that she was learning her sister needed to feel present in a life from which distance had separated her. And Clara wrote back with the equally specific details of life on the Tucson homestead. Thomas William, Clara reported in August, had taken his first steps, which Eliza had already witnessed and written about, but which Clara received the news of with the appropriate enthusiasm. Thomas William walked at 9 months and talked at 12, early for both by any measure, and Jed received both of these developments with the contained delight of a man who has not allowed himself to expect much good news and is therefore moved more than usual when it arrives. He taught the boy to say the names of animals by showing him the tracks in the creek mud, and the boy's first clear word was deer, which he repeated with evident satisfaction approximately 400 times over the following week. Jed finished the cabin addition before the first snow of 1874, working through October in the shortening days with a focused urgency that Eliza eventually understood was because she had told him in September that she was expecting again. He added 2 rooms to the north side of the cabin, a proper bedroom for them, and a second smaller room that he framed out and left for future specification, a term that made her laugh out loud at its careful practicality. The second pregnancy was easier than the first, which she attributed partly to being in better health and partly to being in a place where she felt genuinely safe, which she had not felt during the first one. She grew large through the mountain winter with the comfortable solidity of a woman who is eating well and sleeping warm. And Jed watched the whole process with an attentiveness that had evolved, she noted with some amusement, from the practical concern of a man managing a situation to something much closer to open wonder. "You are staring," she told him one February evening. "I am," he agreed, not even slightly embarrassed. "It is not the first time you have seen this." "No," he said, "but the first time was not my child." The words were said quietly and without performance, and they hit her in the chest with the particular force of things that are both perfectly true and more generous than they need to be. She reached across the table and put her hand over his and said nothing, because nothing was necessary. The second baby arrived in May, with the mountain spring in full, exuberant progress and the creek running high and cold with snowmelt. This time there was no Clara, no minister's wife, no one but Eliza and Jed, and a midwife who lived 8 miles away and had been recruited months in advance and arrived in the morning, calm and competent, just when she was needed. It was a boy again. They named him Samuel Harlan Caldwell, taking Eliza's surname now as a matter of established family identity. She was still Eliza Caldwell, she had explained to Jed when the question arose, not out of any reservation about him, but because Caldwell was the name she had built herself out of. And he had said that made complete sense, and he would be proud to have his name in the middle of his sons. Samuel Harlan Caldwell came into the world with a vigor that his brother had set a high standard for and matched entirely, and he had his father's amber eyes from very nearly the beginning. Thomas William, now 18 months old and in full command of several dozen words in the run of the cabin floor, was fascinated by his brother in the way of a person who has been the sole center of attention and is processing the adjustment in real time. He stood at the edge of the cradle and regarded the new baby with his dark eyes, Thomas's eyes, Eliza always thought, looking at her older son, and then looked up at Jed and said, "Baby loud?" "Yes," Jed said. "Babies are loud." "Baby mine?" "Baby yours," Jed said. Thomas Williams seemed satisfied with this and went back to the business of stacking the wooden blocks Jed had made him, and within a week was aggressively affectionate with his brother in the way of toddlers who have decided something belongs to them. The summer of 1875 was the summer Jed was approached by a man who was mapping the Mazatzal Range for the Territorial Surveyor's Office, a lean, precise man named Hollis Crane, who arrived at the cabin on horseback with a letter of introduction and a commission to hire anyone who knew these mountains well enough to serve as a guide through the high country that had not yet been properly charted. He offered good pay for the work, and Jed spent an evening thinking about it in the way he thought about things that mattered before he told Eliza. "How long?" she asked. 6 weeks, he said. "Maybe 8. 6 weeks. She thought about it honestly, turning it over the way she turned everything over, looking at its actual dimensions. Thomas William was 2.5. Samuel was 3 months. The cabin was solid and well supplied. She was not, she reflected, the woman who had collapsed in the Arizona dust 2 years ago. She was a woman who had spent 2 years learning the mountains. "I can manage," she said. "I know you can," he said. "That is not what I'm asking." She looked at him. "Go," she said. "Do good work. Come home." He did all 3. He was gone 7 weeks, and she managed with the practical thoroughness she brought to everything, and the 7 weeks were a measure of what she had become in the time since she had arrived here, a woman at ease in her life in a way she had not been before. She discovered that she was genuinely content in the mountains, that the things that had seemed isolating at first had become the specific texture of a life she had built and chosen. When Jed came back in late September with pay in his pocket and several weeks of stored-up quiet in his expression that broke open into warmth the moment he saw her standing on the porch, she stood in the circle of his arms for a long time and thought about all the luck and disaster and stubbornness that had arranged itself into this particular life, and felt nothing but gratitude for the arrangement. The years arranged themselves the way years do in a life that is full and purposeful, in a long succession that felt both rapid and complete. Thomas William grew into a serious, curious boy who read everything that came within his reach and asked questions about the world with a persistence that Eliza recognized as both a Caldwell trait and something of his own. He was Thomas's son in his mind, in the quality of his intelligence and the warm humor that showed up early, And he was the mountain's child too, with the practical competence that came from growing up in a place where competence was not optional. Jed taught him to track, to read weather, to handle a horse, and Thomas William received all of this teaching with the focused attention of a student who understands that what he is learning is how to be alive in the world. Samuel was louder and more physical than his brother, built along his father's lines from early on, and interested in every creature that crossed the property with an intensity that made Eliza put away valuables whenever she saw him coming in from the creek with a new discovery. He had Jed's amber eyes and Eliza's Caldwell stubbornness, and the specific combination made for a very particular kind of challenge, which Jed handled with the patience of a man for whom patience was not an effort but a natural state. In the fall of 1876, they rode south to visit Clara and Robert, all of them, Jed and Eliza on horseback, Thomas William old enough now to ride his own pony, Samuel in a carrier on Eliza's back for the first stretch and transferred to Jed when his arms began to complain. The reunion at the Burrows homestead was the kind that involved two families who have missed each other across a year's separation, with much simultaneous talking and Clara holding Samuel for approximately 4 consecutive hours without showing any sign of relinquishing him. Robert Burrows and Jed Harlan sat on the porch the second evening and talked in the easy way of men who have become friends through the particular proof of time and consistent character, and Eliza watched them from the kitchen window where she and Clara were making supper together and felt something swell in her chest that was the specific emotion of seeing a life fully assembled, of knowing that the people you love are loved also by other people, that the web of connection is real and strong. "You are happy," Clara said, watching her. "Very much," Eliza said. Clara looked at her with the particular look that older sisters have when they feel vindicated by events. "I am glad," she said. "When Jed brought you in off that trail, I will tell you, I thought things were going to be all right. There was something about the way he carried you in off that horse." Eliza smiled at the memory of it, the heat and the dust and the sheer relief of shade and water and those large, careful hands. There was something about it, she agreed. They rode home through October, and October in the Mazatzal range was exactly what Jed had described to her on the porch of May's boarding house 3 years ago. The aspens turned to a yellow so vivid it looked like light rather than color, and the mountain air was sharp and clean and smelled of pine and cold granite and the particular note of wood smoke that meant the first fires of the season. They made camp the second night in a high meadow where the grass had gone gold and the sky was the deep pure blue that only the mountains gave you. And after the boys were asleep, Eliza sat beside the fire and looked at her husband, who was looking at the stars with the expression of a man who is exactly where he has always needed to be. "Jed," she said. He looked at her. "I need to tell you something." Something moved through his expression, a quickening, a careful hope that she recognized from the time before Samuel. "We are having another baby," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he smiled, which was different from the corner of the mouth movement that was his usual concession to amusement. It was a full and genuine and entirely unguarded smile, and it was one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen on any human face. "When?" he said. "March," she said. "Maybe April." "Then we have time to finish the porch railing," he said. She laughed until Samuel shifted in his sleep, and she had to put her hand over her mouth. The third baby was a girl. She was born on a clear March evening with a dusting of late snow on the ground outside the cabin and the creek running loud and cold in the dark, and she arrived in the world with a quietness that was different from her brother's operatic entrances, looking around with wide dark eyes as though she had been here before and was simply checking to confirm that things were in order. They named her Rose Caldwell Harlan, Eliza's name first this time, a deliberate choice that Jed proposed himself because he said their daughter should have her mother's full inheritance in her name, and she had Eliza's dark hair and Jed's broad forehead and some third thing that was entirely her own, a quality of stillness and watchfulness that made people feel, even when she was very small, that she was paying attention to more than you might think. Thomas William was 4.5 when Rose arrived, and he received his sister with the combination of protective instinct and intellectual curiosity that characterized everything he did. He sat beside the cradle for long stretches in her first days, watching her with the focused attention he brought to anything he wanted to understand. And when Jed asked him what he was thinking, he said, very seriously, that he was learning her. Jed told this to Eliza later with a fullness in his voice that she had come to recognize as what happened to him when the children surprised him with something he had not known to expect from them. And she held his hand in the lamplight of the cabin and thought about how the word lucky was too small and thin for what she felt, but that she did not have a better one available. The spring of 1877 brought a visitor that neither of them had expected. May Alcott arrived at the cabin in April, having made the journey from Cottonwood Creek with the stubborn determination of a 63-year-old woman who has decided she wants to see something and has not found a practical reason persuasive enough to stop her. She rode in on a steady brown mare, accompanied by a young man from the town who had agreed to escort her as far as the base of the mountain road, and she came up the final stretch alone, which surprised Jed considerably. "I told you I wanted to know how it turned out," she said, accepting the coffee Eliza pressed into her hands and looking around the cabin with the sharp, assessing eyes of a woman who expects to have her judgment confirmed and is finding that it is. "I also wanted to meet the babies." She stayed a week, which was longer than she had planned and shorter than they asked her to stay, and in that week she and Eliza fell into a friendship that had been implicit in the 2 weeks at the boarding house, but was now given room to expand into something genuine and mutual. May held Rose with the competence of a woman who has held hundreds of babies, and she told Thomas Williams stories about the early days in Arizona that widened his eyes at regular intervals, and she played cards with Samuel with the patient ruthlessness of someone who was not going to let a 3-year-old win just because he was 3. On her last evening, she and Eliza sat on the porch while Jed was doing the evening barn work, and the boys were asleep and Rose was in her cradle inside. "He loves you extravagantly," May said. "You know that." "I know," Eliza said, "and you love him." "Yes," she said simply. May looked at the mountains in the last light. "I've seen a lot of people come through Cottonwood Creek," she said. "Seen a lot of people start things out there on the trail. Not many of them land somewhere good. Most of them are still searching, one way or another." She paused. "You two have landed." Eliza thought about the trail, the heat, the dust, the moment the ground had come up to meet her. She thought about the shadow falling across her, and the voice, and the water, and the boots from the general store, and evenings on the porch, and the cold creek, and 3 children asleep in the rooms he had built. She thought about the word landed, and found it was exactly right. "We have," she said. Summer came to the mountains in its gradual and generous way, warming from the snowmelt chill of April through the full green heat of July, and the cabin with its additions was full in the way that a house is full when the people inside it are living rather than simply occupying space. Thomas William and Samuel created a chaos of activity from first light to last that Jed managed with the calm authority of a man who was not intimidated by children any more than he was intimidated by weather, and Rose watched all of it from her increasingly mobile vantage points with the same dark-eyed attentiveness she had been born with. In July, Jed took Thomas William on his first real tracking expedition, 2 days up into the high country, just the two of them, with bedrolls and hardtack and the careful teaching that Jed had been laying foundations for since the boy could walk. They came back on the second evening with Thomas William simultaneously exhausted and incandescent with stories, talking at a speed that made even Eliza, who had not thought her son capable of talking faster than his usual high velocity, work to keep up. He had tracked an elk for 6 hours. He had found a spring that Jed said was not on any map. He had identified 3 different types of tracks at a mud crossing. He reported, been absolutely terrified when they heard something large moving through the brush in the dark, and Jed had said quietly that it was a deer and had been entirely right. Jed, washing up at the creek after returning the horses, met Eliza's eyes over Thomas Williams' still-running narrative, and the look they exchanged over the boy's head was the particular look of 2 people who understand simultaneously that something important has just happened, some passage, some initiation into the specific inheritance of this place. "You did good with him up there," she said later, when the boys were asleep and Rose was nursing and the cabin was quiet. "He did most of it himself," Jed said. "I just showed him where to look." "That's what good teaching is," she said. He considered this with the slow seriousness he brought to compliments, as though he wanted to be honest about whether he agreed with them rather than simply accept them. Then he nodded once, and that was his version of thank you. The fall roundup of 1877 brought a new development in the form of a letter from Robert Burroughs, delivered by a rider passing north, reporting that the grazing territory east of the homestead was being disputed by a cattle company out of Tucson that was using the sort of legal maneuvering that had become increasingly common as the territory was settled, and the question of who owned what had grown urgent. Robert wrote with his characteristic brevity that he was dealing with it and did not anticipate serious trouble, but that it was annoying, which Eliza recognized as Robert's way of saying it was genuinely concerning without admitting to worry. Jed read the letter twice and said, "We should go down in the spring." "I was thinking the same," Eliza said. They went in April of 1878 and found the dispute still in progress. A surveyor hired by the cattle company had drawn a line that put two of Robert's best water sources on the wrong side of a contested boundary, and the legal wrangling had been going on for months without resolution. The Territorial Land Office in Tucson was involved, which meant paperwork and waiting, and in the meantime, Robert was managing the situation with a tight-jawed patience that Eliza recognized as a man keeping his temper by an act of sustained will. Jed, whose experience in scouting and whose reputation in the territory had given him a certain standing with the land office, made the trip into Tucson and sat down with the relevant officials and made the kind of quiet, specific, well-documented argument that is more effective than noise. He spent 3 days in town doing this, and on the 4th day came back with a favorable preliminary ruling that would require the cattle company to commission a new survey from a neutral party. It was not a final resolution, but it was a decisive step in the right direction. Robert shook Jed's hand at the news and said exactly what he had said the first time they met, which was, "Good man," and this time the weight of it had 3 years of evidence behind it. Clara made the best dinner anyone had eaten in a while, and insisted on opening a bottle of Madeira wine that had been sitting on a shelf in the parlor for 2 years, waiting for an occasion worthy of it. The children ran in the yard together, the Burroughs children and the Harlan children, and Eliza watched them from the porch and thought about Thomas William, not the son, but the man, the husband, who had brought her west with plans and enthusiasm and a heart full of good intentions, and who had died before any of the plans had come to fruition. She thought about grief and what it did to time, how it made some things feel very recent and very far away simultaneously. She thought about how it was possible to fully mourn someone and also fully live, how these two things were not in competition, how in fact the living was its own form of honor. Jed came to stand beside her on the porch, and she put her hand through his arm in the way she had come to do automatically, a habit of nearness that had grown up so gradually she could not have identified when it had become natural. "He would have liked you," she said. Jed was quiet for a moment. "Thomas?" "Yes. He valued honest people, competent people. You were both." She paused. "He would have been relieved, I think, that someone is here." "I'm glad to be here," Jed said, with a simplicity that was its own kind of eloquence. They stayed at the Burroughs homestead for 3 weeks, and the legal question settled itself satisfactorily by the end of it. The new survey was commissioned and the water rights confirmed for Robert, which was not the end of the pressures that the growing cattle industry was bringing to bear on small homesteaders in Arizona territory. But it was a good outcome for this particular fight, and good outcomes were worth celebrating when they came. The trip home in May was everything the mountains promised in that season. The high passes still snowy, but the lower elevations in full spring riot, wildflowers in the meadows, and the creek running full, and the aspens in new leaf, that first tender green that lasted only a week before deepening into summer. Jed rode ahead to check the trail, and Eliza came behind with Thomas William on his pony, and Samuel in front of her in the saddle, and Rose strapped to her in the carrier. And she thought, riding through that May landscape, that the life she was living was not the life anyone would have predicted for a surveyor's widow from Ohio, and that unpredictability had turned out to be the best thing that had ever happened to her. That summer, a family named Whitmore settled in the valley below the cabin, the first neighbors within 5 miles they had had since arriving. They were a couple from Missouri, Daniel and Frances Whitmore, with 4 children and a land grant, and the determined look of people who have chosen difficult country deliberately and are prepared to make it work. Frances Whitmore was the first woman Eliza's age she had had regular access to in years, and the friendship that developed between them was the kind that grows fast in country where companionship is not plentiful, a friendship of practical exchange and genuine warmth that enriched both families. The children from both households merged into a roaming collective that covered the mountain territory between the 2 properties with the thoroughness of a small occupying army. And Thomas William, as the oldest, took on a proprietary seriousness about knowing the territory that Jed observed with quiet satisfaction. On an evening in October, when the aspen gold was at its peak and the air had the specific clarity of high mountain autumn, Eliza sat on the porch with Rose in her lap and watched Jed and Thomas William walking back from the creek together, the big man and the small boy side by side, matching stride for stride in the way that the boy had begun to unconsciously mirror the man's walk. Thomas William was saying something with great animation, and Jed was listening with his full attention, as he always did, and the sight of the 2 of them together in the golden evening light was so entirely right and true that it was almost too much to look at directly. She looked at it anyway. That night, after the children were asleep, she told Jed about the 4th baby, which she had known for 3 weeks and had been carrying as a private secret, turning it over in her private knowledge like something pleasant she was not quite ready to share. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment, and she waited, watching the lamp. "I want to build the porch bigger," he said, "if we are going to be 6 people. She laughed so hard she had to put her hand over her mouth again, and he smiled his full, unguarded smile, and they sat together in the lamplight of the cabin he had built with his own hands while their 3 children slept in the rooms around them, and the creek ran cold in the dark outside, and the mountain held all of them in the bowl of its old silence, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The 4th baby, born in June of 1879, was another boy. They named him William Robert Harlan. William for Thomas William's father, Robert for the man who had become the best kind of family, the kind you choose. And he was the loudest of them all from the first breath, which Samuel considered a personal affront to his position. And Thomas William received as further research data about the nature of babies, and which Rose, who was now 2 and had begun to form strong opinions about the administration of the household, dealt with by deciding that the baby was hers in a particular and proprietary way that she expressed by sitting as close to his cradle as possible and regarding anyone who approached without her approval with considerable skepticism. Jed, holding his 2nd son in the first hours after the birth, had a look on his face that Eliza had never seen quite in this exact form, a look of fullness that was past the point where any expression was adequate, so that what showed was simply a man standing very still because there was no gesture large enough for what he was feeling. She watched him from the bed, exhausted and warm and entirely at peace, and she thought about the trail and the heat and the fall into the dust and the shadow of a stranger blocking the sun, and she understood with perfect clarity that the fall had not been the end of something, but the beginning of everything. She thought about Thomas, as she always did when the new ones arrived, because loving Jed completely did not diminish what Thomas had been to her, and the children were the testament to both of those truths simultaneously. Thomas William carried his father's mind and his father's name, and would always be the living proof that love is not erased by death, but transformed into the ongoing work of the people left behind. And Samuel and Rose and William Robert were the proof that love is also renewable, that the heart does not have a fixed capacity, that every person you let in genuinely makes the space larger rather than smaller. May Alcott made a 2nd visit in the fall of 1879, this time with a companion, a widower from Cottonwood Creek named George Hicks, who had the look of a man who had spent considerable time being quietly admired by May, and had recently decided to do something about it. May was 65 and had the energy of someone who had conserved it carefully for exactly this kind of occasion, and she and George sat on the expanded porch of the Harlan cabin and talked with the ease of 2 people who have known each other for a long time and are enjoying very much the act of being known. Eliza watched May with William Robert on her lap, the old woman's iron-gray hair glinting in the October sun, and felt the particular happiness of seeing someone who had been unfairly solitary for too long in the company of someone who suited them. "You look pleased," Jed said from beside her. "May is going to be all right," Eliza said. He looked across the porch at the older woman and the widower and nodded slowly. "Good," he said. That year, the Whitmores hosted a harvest gathering that brought together every family within a 10-mile radius of the valley, which turned out to be more families than Eliza had realized were in the territory, a collection of people who had come from everywhere to this specific mountain country and made lives in it that had the common stamp of hard work and genuine rootedness. There was music, someone with a fiddle, and dancing on the packed earth outside the Whitmore barn, and the children ran in the dark between the lanterns until they dropped. Jed danced with Eliza twice, which was 2 more times than he had ever danced before in his life, he said, and he was not wrong that it showed, but what it also showed was that he was trying, which she found significantly more appealing than natural grace would have been. "You are a terrible dancer," she said, laughing against his shoulder. "I know," he said. "I will keep practicing." "At what interval?" "Annually," he said, with perfect seriousness, and she laughed again and let him spin her in his rough approximation of a waltz under the stars of the October Arizona mountain sky, while the fiddle played and the lanterns swayed and their children slept in a pile somewhere in the Whitmore barn under a shared blanket. The years continued to build, one on another, in the way of a life that is working as it should, not always easily, because nothing in mountain country is easy, but with the deep satisfaction of work that means something and love that has been chosen consciously rather than simply fallen into. Jed added the larger porch and another room when it became clear that 4 children sharing sleeping arrangements with any pretense of order was optimistic, and then a root cellar against the south wall that Eliza had wanted since the first winter, and which proved its worth immediately. Thomas William at 10 was a person of startling competence who had read every book in the cabin twice and written letters to Clara's children and to May asking for more, and who understood the mountain territory around the cabin better than many adults twice his age. He was Thomas Caldwell's son in his curiosity and humor and the gentle quality of his attention, and he was the mountain's son in his practical knowledge and his instinctive reading of weather and terrain, and he was his own person in the steady moral seriousness that showed up early and stayed, that quality of thinking carefully about what was right and acting on it without requiring applause. Samuel at 8 was physical and bold and devoted to his father in the unself-conscious way of a boy who finds in one person the clearest possible example of what he wants to become. He was learning to track with the same focused determination that Jed brought to everything, and he had recently announced his intention to be a mountain man exactly like his father, which Eliza received with the complicated tenderness of a mother who recognizes her own feelings in her child's voice and also knows that life will have its own plans. Rose at 4 was the one who worried Eliza not at all and surprised her constantly, a small, dark-eyed person who conducted the household social arrangements with the authority of someone who has decided that she is in charge of everyone's feelings and is taking the responsibility seriously. She had adopted William Robert as her particular project since his birth, and the relationship between them was the kind of total, unquestioned devotion that only the very young manage, based on nothing but proximity and the simple fact of one person deciding that another person is theirs. William Robert at 1 was good-natured and strong, and had the amber eyes that Samuel had also inherited, a Harlan characteristic apparently dominant enough to show up in the second generation, and he moved through the world with the cheerful confidence of a child who has grown up surrounded by people who are entirely glad he exists. On the evening of their 5th wedding anniversary, December 1878, by the Harlan calendar, though they counted from the day on the porch at the Burroughs homestead rather than the ceremony, because that was when it had actually started, Jed presented Eliza with a carved wooden box that he had been working on in the evenings for 3 months, which she had noticed and pretended not to, because she recognized something being made with care and did not want to interrupt it. The box was beautiful, not decorated in an ornate way, but carved with the kind of precise, attentive craft that showed in everything Jed made, The wood fitted and joined so perfectly it had no gaps, with a small iron latch and hinges that he had made himself from scrap metal. On the lid, he had carved a mountain range and a creek, simple lines that were unmistakably the specific mountains and the specific creek outside the cabin door. Inside the box was the letter, a single page in his large, careful handwriting, which was the handwriting of a man who had taught himself to write from a single school book at the age of 10, and had written with great deliberateness ever since. She read it by the lamplight with Jed on the other side of the table watching her with an expression he was not bothering to control. The letter said what he felt about her, plainly and completely, in the way he said everything, not poetically, but with the honesty of someone who has thought carefully about what is true and is reporting it as accurately as language allows. It said what the last 5 years had meant. It said what the next 50 looked like from where he was standing. It said, at the end, that he had not known what he was riding toward on that hot July afternoon on the Butterfield Trail, but that he was grateful every day for whatever arrangement of circumstances had put him on that road at that particular hour, and that he intended to spend the rest of his life being worthy of what he had found there. Eliza folded the letter and put it back in the box and sat for a moment with her hands over it. "You made the box to put the letter in," she said. "Yes," he said. "You made the box first, as a reason to make the letter." "The letter needed a good home," he said. She looked at him across the table, this enormous, quiet, pine-scented man who had lifted her out of the burning dust of the Arizona Trail and had been her home ever since, in the truest sense of the word. And she said, "I love you, Jed Harlan. I have loved you for a long time, and I intend to love you for a very much longer time, and I want you to know that I know what I have." He held her gaze with his amber eyes for a long, complete moment. "I know what I have," he said. "I count it every day." The children grew, and the cabin grew with them, and the mountain held all of them in its old indifferent beauty, the pine forests and the granite creeks and the aspens that went gold every October, and the snow that came every November and the spring that returned every April, with the reliable fidelity of something that cannot help but come back. May and George were married in the spring of 1880, a fact that Eliza received in a letter from Cottonwood Creek with a joy that was entirely out of proportion to the length of the letter, and that she read aloud to Jed on the porch while Rose sat between them, pulling apart a pine cone with systematic focus, and William Robert pulled himself along the porch railing, and Thomas, William, and Samuel argued somewhere in the middle distance about whose turn it was with the fishing pole. Clara and Robert came north in the summer of 1880 with their 3 children, and the week the two families spent together at the mountain cabin was the kind of thing that lodges itself permanently in the memory as an emblem of what the best times feel like. The children colonized every available surface, and Clara and Eliza talked for 7 days with the ferocity of 2 women making up for a year's worth of things to say. And Robert and Jed worked on the new paddock fence that Jed had been planning since February and was happy to have 4 extra hands for. And in the evenings, they all sat on the big porch together in the cooling mountain air and were, collectively and completely, at peace. On the last evening, after the children were all in their respective beds and Clara and Robert had gone to their room, Jed and Eliza sat alone on the porch for the first time in a week. The stars were out in the full density of the mountain sky, more stars than any other sky Eliza had ever seen could manage, as though the altitude bought you access to more of the universe than the people in the lowlands were allowed to see. "Next year," Jed said after a while. "What about it?" "I was thinking we should make the trip south," he said. "Maybe all the way to the Burroughs place and then to Cottonwood Creek. See May. Show the children where it started." She turned and looked at him. "Where it started," she said. "The trail," he said. "I want to show them the stretch of trail where I found their mother." She thought about this for a moment, the hot July dust, the cracked boots, the unforgiving sun, the shadow of a man on horseback blocking the light, a voice asking, "Can you hear me?" "It is not a particularly scenic stretch of trail," she said. "No," he said, "but it is the most important piece of ground I have ever stood on." She leaned against him, which was where she had been leaning, in one sense or another, for the better part of 6 years, and his arm came around her with the unhurried ease of absolute familiarity. "Then we will show them," she said. They did the following summer. They made the journey south, all 6 of them, which required considerable logistics and a pack mule, and more planning than Jed was entirely accustomed to, but he managed it with the methodical competence of a man who has discovered that having people worth planning for is not a burden, but a privilege. They stopped at the stretch of the old Butterfield Trail on a July morning, which was the right month, though, 6 years later, and the sun was doing exactly what it had been doing that first afternoon, making the cracked red earth shimmer and the air above it dance. Jed stopped his horse at the place he remembered, which he located with a certainty that said he had never stopped knowing exactly where it was. The children looked at it with the polite attention of people viewing something important on the assurance of an adult. "This is where your mother fell," Jed said. He did not say it dramatically. He said it the way he said everything, with the simple honesty of a man making a record of something true. Thomas William looked at his mother with the dark, serious eyes that had always seen more than you expected. "You were very sick," he said. "Very," she agreed. "Very hot and very thirsty and very tired, and your father came riding up." "And you knew?" Samuel asked, with the directness of a boy who has heard enough love stories to know what they are supposed to contain. "Not then," she said. "Not all at once." "When?" Rose demanded, because Rose was 5 and believed in the efficiency of direct questions. Eliza looked at Jed. He was looking back at her with the amber eyes that had been looking at her honestly for 6 years, that had been looking at her in the hot noon shadow of a buckskin horse while she drank warm water in small, careful sips from his canteen. "On the porch," she said, "in Cottonwood Creek. He sat beside me and he talked about his mountains, and I listened, and I knew." Jed held her gaze for a moment, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way it had been moving for 6 years, not quite a smile, and more than a smile. "She asked me to tell her about the mountains," he said to the children, "and I talked for about an hour, which was more talking than I had done in a year." "Was it hard?" Thomas William asked. "No," he said. "It was easy. She made it easy." He looked at her again, and in that look was everything. The trail and the water and the boots from the general store and the evenings on the porch and the mountain cabin and the children and the box with the letter inside it and the 5 years and the years still coming. All of it contained in the way he looked at her, the way he had always looked at her, with the complete and uncomplicated attention of a man who has found the thing he did not know he was looking for and intends, absolutely, to keep it. Eliza Harlan looked at the stretch of cracked red earth where she had fallen, and at the man and the children arranged around her in the July heat, and at the mountains waiting to the north where their life was built and rooted and real. And she thought that the place where you fall is not always the worst place in your story. Sometimes the falling is the thing that gets you to the place where the right person finally finds you, and the finding is the beginning of everything worth telling. She clicked her tongue at her horse and turned toward home. And all of them, the mountain man with the amber eyes and the arms that had lifted her out of the dust, the dark-eyed boy who carried his father's name in his mother's mind, the bold, amber-eyed son who was growing daily into his father's shape, the watchful, dark-haired girl who had appointed herself the keeper of everyone she loved, and the youngest, the cheerful, strong-lunged boy who did not yet know all the story that had been made for him. All of them turned with her and rode north through the July heat toward the mountains, toward the pines and the cold creek and the cabin built with careful hands, toward the life that had been built out of disaster and rescue, and 2 weeks in a small sun-bleached town, and a conversation on a porch about mountains, toward everything that the word home had ever meant and more besides. The trail stretched ahead of them, long and red and shimmering with heat, and the mountains waited at the end of it. And above everything the Arizona sky spread itself out in its enormous and indifferent blue, the same sky that had burned down on a woman walking alone in the dust of 1873, and it also looked on while a man with amber eyes and careful hands had ridden toward her out of the shimmer and lifted her up. It had been watching all along,